Thank you very much. Initially, when I replied to the invitation for this, I assumed that I was coming to be a participant and just to sit and watch what was going on. And then I got an invite only about a week ago to actually come and speak. So I'm quite pleased to actually be here to speak to you. Now, it's slightly challenging being a British MEP in the European Parliament at the moment, as I'm sure you can all imagine. I was on the Remain side in the first place, which makes me a lot more popular here, I suspect, than it does in my constituency, because my constituency was Brexit central. 65% of my constituency voted to leave the EU. So I get to see both sides of the argument quite clearly. And I think the first thing to say is that despite some of the difficulties in the UK, I mean, the UK is on the path to leave the EU. We are going to leave the EU. And there are huge numbers of issues, not just free flow of data, not just digital issues, but across the board that need to be discussed and sorted out very, very quickly before that exit date at the end of March 2019. At the moment, as you all know, the talks are slightly stuck over the divorce elements. I think it's got to be in all our interests to get to the future discussions about what the future relationship are going to be as soon as possible. And that's certainly what I think the British MEPs here are trying to get that message across, that we really need to start talking about future, because it is going to affect everyone on all sides, whatever the outcome is. Now, in terms of sort of data, free flow of data in particular, but data issues in general, I think it's worth outlining a little bit where the UK stands in this. I mean, the UK is probably the leader within the EU in digital services, in digital take-up. 43% of large EU digital companies were started in the UK. The UK is the largest internet economy as a percentage of GDP of all G20 countries. 11.5% of global cross-border data flows in 2015 were through the UK. And that's for a country of only 3.9% of global GDP, 0.9% of global population. So the UK really is the most important member state with regards to tech and digital and data in general. And I think to deal with Brexit, there are two sort of different stances that I think the UK government can take going forward. One is that the UK government says we are just going to mirror all EU legislation in this area, and that will mean that it smooths the path to some sort of adequacy agreement or agreement in terms of being able to move data across borders. That would be the easiest approach. The problem is that obviously impinges on some of the concerns that the UK government has in terms of ECJ jurisdiction, control over rules as they change in the future, and some sort of say over those rules. So I think, and also that assumes that the European Union will take a sensible approach to regulating this area in the future. And those of you who followed the debate on e-privacy maybe sort of see that there are some challenges with the EU approach in terms of challenges it is making towards tech industries in general. My personal feeling is that if we go along the lines of the current e-privacy directive in future, the UK will almost certainly like to have a different regulatory framework, because the way e-privacy is going, particularly from the Commission, particularly from the Parliament position, is that it's going to make it much more difficult for our companies in Europe to scale up and to challenge at a global level competitors in the US. So I think it's very likely that the UK actually is able to be in quite a good position in tech in general, because it may well take the similar view to Europe, but slightly different specific rules, particularly on data protection and these sort of things. And that will allow the UK probably to have continue as a gateway to the US in tech, but also a gateway to the EU. But that is only possible, of course, as I guess you all know, if some sort of adequacy agreement is agreed between the UK and the EU. Now, it's sure from the UK side, this is probably the most important issue. Without such an agreement, all of those that type of vision falls flat. Now, how are we going to get that? I mean, that's also challenging because some of the regulations in the UK are moving in a different direction to some of the ones that we've seen in the EU already. For example, the Investigatory Powers Act in the UK gave the UK government quite strong powers to check internet search histories and what pretty much everyone in the UK is doing online. Now, that is, of course, not in line with what would be needed from the EU in terms of getting an adequacy agreement. So there is going to have to be some debate going forward as to how the UK can change its approach in some areas in the same way that the US did on security issues to ensure that it's good enough for the EU to have an adequacy agreement. But also at the same time, security issues are also big issues for many European countries, not just for the UK alone. So I think there is some debate that we can have about how we manage the security relationship, the passing of personal data, and what people are doing online that is important for the security services to keep us all safe, but at the same time to protect the very important fundamental right to privacy that is enshrined in the EU treaties and is very important, not just on the EU side, but also from the UK side. I guess there's not that much here that I've said that any of you are unfamiliar with. I suspect some of the future speakers will be saying similar things. One thing I would just say to end on this, though, is that the UK and the EU start from a much better position to discuss all of this than the EU and the US did, because generally we have the same vision. We generally believe in data protection. We generally believe that privacy is a fundamental right. So starting from that viewpoint, which I think was slightly different in the EU-US relations, where we had to come from very different positions to finally get agreements on adequacy, with the UK, we start from the same point, and I think that will ultimately make it easier to get a agreement. And I've said so far this is very, very important for the UK. It's also very important for the EU. And I think we need to recognise that. I'm not one of these British politicians who will stand up and say the EU needs the UK and all of this stuff. I appreciate that there is many sides to this battle, but it is clear if we do not have some sort of agreement that allows free flow of data to continue between the UK and the EU, everyone in these industries are going to suffer and consumers are going to suffer. And I don't think anyone wants that. And I can assure you from our side, it's in everyone's interest to make sure that we get that deal. So I will end it there, and I look forward to hearing from the other speakers. Thank you.